Cha-cha.
It's on page 1 of section H2.
Woohoo! Stop the presses!
So that I don't get disturbed. Let's see. Well, by people calling me. Anyway. All right. So
we can't help the disturbance that lives inside us.
No, that's true. No, and the grave disturbance in the force. Don't get me started. Tom Merritt's here with us, everybody. Tom Merritt. You know Tom Merritt from, what are we going to say today? Daily Tech News Show, I'd say, is probably your biggest thing. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the Daily Tech News Show empire just launched its first show that I have never hosted and most likely never will.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. What's that?
It's called Noticias Tecnología Express. It's a weekly roundup of tech headlines in Spanish, hosted by Dan Campos from Mexico City.
Wow. That's really cool. All right, now, let's talk about that later this week. Well, no, that could be news to you, though. How the heck did that happen? And how does it happen that this guy who apparently, no offense, but who apparently can do this thing without you is doing this thing with you?
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to be on a few of Dan's shows. So he's got some great podcasts, and we've had him on Daily Tech News Show before. I put a call out for people to help Rich Straffolino with Daily Tech Headlines, the daily English roundup of tech headlines. Something I started, I still occasionally host, but it's mostly Rich now. And Dan responded, and I said, well, Dan, what if instead of having you do an English language version of headlines every so often, we started an entirely new show? And Dan was like, this sounds great. And then we decided to do it.
Where can people find that?
dailytechnewsshow.com/NTX. Or it's in the Apple Podcast Store now. You can just search around for it. NTX.
Very cool. That is not the thing, I assume, unless this is your, clever stump switch something.
Yes. A Spanish language tech news show is probably not the news of the week that I wanted to talk about.
Well, for you, it could be. But yeah, I think people know this, but I'll go ahead and say anyway that Monday on this show, in a few minutes, I'd like to hear from other people about what is news to them, because what's news to me is Apple stuff and Apple stuff and Apple stuff. And I'm not saying that Tom's won't be an Apple thing as well, but I know that the things that interest me don't necessarily interest everybody else, or maybe it's not the thing that they're focused on. And so I turn it over to the guest and say, hey, what's news to you? Which I'm about to do right now. Hey, Tom Merritt, what's news to you?
Yeah, man. I got a lot of news stories to pick from every week doing Daily Tech News Show. But the one that I'm following the closest personally, and I feel might not be covered as much as it should be, is the growing chip shortage. NXP and Infineon both say that chip constraints are no longer limited to their automotive lines, but are spreading to other lines. Apple and Sony both said their newest models are affected by production bottlenecks. PS5 for Sony, one of the iPhone 12 models for Apple, and it's caused by the pandemic. Mostly at root, but also a little bit by U.S. trade restrictions.
Well, I want to hear about both of those. I'm trying to decide which one I should ask first. Why would it be caused by the pandemic? Because we had, obviously, a hit to the supply chain this time last year, but we were under the impression, or at least I was under the impression, that things had picked back up. But there was an article I read earlier this week, and I've only read a little bit on this, but there was an article that I read earlier this week that said that basically a lot of companies sort of drew down their expectations because they didn't know what was going to happen in #these uncertain times. But now they're saying, oh, well, people with money are still, buying things, so we need to make these things. And crap, we canceled those orders. Is that the problem on the supply chain, or is it something else?
That's pretty close to it. Mostly the automotive sector underestimated its bounce back. That's one of the roots of the problem. So the automotive sector downgraded its chip orders after the pandemic, and rightly so. People stopped buying cars for a while, and then didn't ramp them up fast enough. That, combined with everyone buying lots of laptops and home electronics for work from home, meant that manufacturers switched over their production priorities to home electronics, And now that automotive is coming back in, there's not all the capacity that they need to meet the demand for chips. So you even have GM temporarily shutting down 3 North American plants, Ford projecting a 20% drop in output, not because of demand, because they just can't make all the cars they want because they can't get the chips they need. Now that explains the automotive sector. The reason it's spreading is partly because of capacity problems. So you have manufacturers trying to do social distancing, changing the protocols to adapt to COVID. That means that maybe they can't produce chips as fast as they wanted to. So you have some companies trying to figure out, okay, well, if we can shift a little bit to automotive, how does that impact other things? That's all apparently complicated by the U.S. trade restrictions on Huawei, which saw Huawei last year in the midst of all of this stockpile a bunch of chips. Mm-hmm. And as soon as they stockpiled chips, a lot of other companies said, oh, well, we've got this chip crunch and Huawei's stockpiling chips. Maybe we better stockpile chips just to be safe. We're probably going to be okay, but can't be too safe, right? Can't be too careful. And the same thing that drove toilet paper off of our grocery store shelves, essentially, it has caused a chip shortage because higher orders to stockpile, maxed out these capacities. Now, that will eventually work itself out. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, you're already seeing shortages from NVIDIA, from PlayStation, some iPhone models. And it looks like it's going to spread before it finally evens back out, especially because if the demand stays high, which it has, everybody thought, oh, well, we'll have a surge, everybody works from home, and then everybody will have the devices they need. It hasn't really worked out. If the demand stays high, they'll have to bring on new plants. And to bring on new plants usually takes a year or two.
When you say demand stays high, is demand staying high across the board? Because obviously when Apple introduces a new iPhone, there's going to be a demand for new iPhones. Are you saying demand is staying high like all across? Or
yeah,
are we
across all electronics. And nobody really knows exactly why, but it's probably a combination of factors. Work from home is causing more people to say, I might be doing this longer. Maybe I need a better laptop. There's a little bit of that. There's also, well, I didn't take that vacation to Hawaii last year, so I can spend a little more money to get a nicer phone. People who avoided spending money on the electronics they didn't have to get earlier in the year, now saying, oh, you know what? It looks like things are going to be okay for me. I'll go ahead and splash out on something. So it's a combination of that and probably some other things that I'm not even thinking of and other people haven't yet either.
It's really gratifying to hear you say that because I've said both of those things. It's like, yes, and it's a weird, we're doing the Tale of Two Cities things right now, except it's a Tale of Two Planets because, there are food lines, there are people who are, being evicted. Then there are other people who are, I don't want to say they're fine, but they haven't lost any income. And they didn't take that vacation. They didn't buy, that new thing. And then there are also the people who are, like you say, going to be sitting staring at this computer forever. And so they figure they might as well like it as much as they can. Or
people who did lose their jobs for a while. But now that, COVID protocols have been figured out or areas have opened back up, are deciding to say, oh, good, my job's back. Now I can spend on something.
Well, I also know somebody who their laptop was their job's. When they lost their job, they basically killed their laptop on the other end. Mm-hmm. So it was useless. Plus, they had to return it. And so then when she was looking for a job, she's like, well, I could buy a $400 laptop, but I don't know how long that'll last me and how good it'll be. I don't know how long this is going to go on. I need a computer that's actually going to, be good for at the very least a year, but maybe as many as 7. And so she went ahead and, dropped a bit of dosh on a MacBook. I want to go back really quickly to what the shortage means, because obviously it's bad for business. Are there hazards as well that maybe we're not thinking about? Or is it just, this is going to suck for a while because it's going to be hard for people to make phones, make consoles. There's going to be a supply-demand imbalance. Is there any, not just business danger? Is there danger to this at all? Or is it, it's going to take a while for this to even out?
It's hard to say. That's not something that I've seen anybody have a clear answer. The shortage spreading could come to areas that are safety sensitive, like airlines, right?
Sure.
Airlines not flying a lot of people right now, scrapping a lot of their older planes because they don't want to spend money to keep them in maintenance, might start wanting to spend on new airplanes. And if there aren't chips to make the airplanes, that means you don't have as many airplanes, which means maybe they decide to pull those older planes out of mothballs after all, which, could be a safety issue. I'm not trying to be scare tactic there, but if we were to see danger, that's the sectors I would look at it from. I don't think you're going to see, it doesn't seem like you're going to see chips that aren't made as well because they're rushing. You might, but it doesn't feel like that's what's happening. It feels like the factories are like, no, this is what we can make safely. U.S. officials met with the Semiconductor Industry Association, Qualcomm, TSMC, Corning, a bunch of folks, trying to figure out what to do. I'm not sure that the government could do anything, though. It's not like you can write an executive order or pass a bill that says make more chips.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, actually, because I caught some headline the other day that said the Biden administration was looking into this. And I'm like, well, okay.
I mean, in the sense of let's get all the stakeholders together and have a conversation and see if we can come up with some ideas. Sure, that could help, but it's not something that they can just wave a magic wand and make it go away.
Let me ask one other question really quickly. You've mentioned a couple of times now that some of the higher end iPhones are having trouble getting the processors that they need. I mean, I'm thinking about things like Apple has locked up 5 nanometer production from TSMC from here to Christmas. And when I say Christmas, I mean, however many Christmases they feel like. We're talking about other processors that are in there. You're not talking about things like the A14 and stuff like that.
That's a really good question. And I don't remember off the top of my head which exact chips. It just says chips for iPhone 12. So maybe that it's, Apple is maybe just playing its usual game of like, yeah, we're having a harder time getting some chips. So we're not selling as many iPhone 12s as we could, and not saying which chips they are. Because even if it's an Apple designed chip, somebody still has to make it. And if that somebody doesn't have the capacity to make it, that could impact Apple. Apple has been very good at stockpiling well before it became cool. So, I imagine that these integrated circuit shortages for the iPhone 12 Pro are probably pretty severe and unexpected, because Apple's pretty good at planning for this stuff.